Hello class, welcome back to biology. We are going to start talking about reproduction. In chapter 46, we're going to kind of look at it from like the parent's perspective, going through anatomy and menstrual cycles. We'll talk about birth control and pregnancy. And then in chapter 47, it's more from like the developing zygote embryos perspective. We'll talk about all the stages of what goes on in different types of animals as they are developing. Okay, if this is something that is a sensitive subject for you, you may be watching this because you wanted to do it at home, or your parents could have some input. And so, welcome to our virtual class. We're going to start by looking at this picture. This is a coral that is reproducing. So all these dots around are actually little polyps from this coral that can land somewhere and start growing a new coral organism. So when we're talking about reproduction in animals, we're not always talking about male and female sexual reproduction. There's actually a lot of variations of reproduction that we're going to talk about that exist within the animal kingdom. Okay, so first let's divide it into asexual and sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when offspring are generated through haploid gametes, through sperm and egg fusing to make a zygote. That's what you see here in this picture. Then we'll talk about different types of sexual reproduction. But right now we're talking about sperm and egg. One thing that's good about sexual reproduction is it increases genetic variability. So that means that as the environment changes, or as you try to move into new environments, there is a greater likelihood that there will be individuals adapted and able to overcome, a different predator coming in, or a different food source, or a very cold winter, or just different situations that could occur. That genetic variability is very important for success of this species as a whole. It doesn't mean each individual would survive, but it means that it's more likely that somebody would survive. However, sexual reproduction can be dangerous. Mating can be dangerous. It can be energetically costly. There's also a risk of STDs. So STDs are not something that exists just in people, but also across the animal kingdom, and also increases the risk of predation. Let's look at this little video that talks about the risk of predation in animals, or in frogs.
Casetify, who sent over this special package with 3...
Finding love is never easy, but Central and South America's Tungera frog has more to worry about than just a broken heart. What you are about to hear is the mating call of the male Tungera frog. But while the love song charms potential mates, it may also attract something else: deadly frog-eating bats. In an evolutionary arms race, researchers say the Tungera frog's natural predator, the fringe-lipped bat, uses a form of sonar to locate the frogs while they belt their serenades. You see, when the Tungera frog produces his mating call, it also produces ripples on the surface of the water surrounding him. Using echolocation, bats are able to sense these ripples and pinpoint the frog's exact location. As Smithsonian Magazine explains, the frog's first line of defense is to stop calling when they see the bats flying overhead. But ripples continue for a few more seconds, essentially creating a watery bullseye for the bat to strike. But the study, which was published this month in the journal Science, notes the frogs aren't without their own strategies to foil the bat's dinner plans. Wired explains the study found frogs that kept a messy house, leaves, sticks, and other materials in the water around them, were able to disrupt the bat's sonar system since the ripples don't form the same way they would if the water was free of debris. In the case of the Tungera frog, sometimes love hurts, a lot. As a frog named Kermit once said, "It's not easy being green." For Newsy, I'm John O'Connor.
Okay, so that's a little bit interesting there. Asexual reproduction is when an animal or an organism is generating offspring without the fusion of an egg and a sperm. It is one parent is able to end up as two separate organisms. This can be through budding. Budding is typically when an animal splits in half roughly evenly, so there's two individuals of roughly the same size. Budding is when you have a little piece like this hydra buds off a little piece. Fission is when you have two organisms of roughly the same size. Fragmentation is when one little piece would break off, like we just saw with the corals. And parthenogenesis, So parthenogenesis is kind of interesting. Parthenogenesis is when an organism lays an egg. So and the organism may sometimes be sexual and sometimes be asexual. The organism lays an egg, and the egg can develop without being fertilized. So in an instance where that organism is able to do both through parthenogenesis sometime or sexual reproduction sometime. So they're still able to reproduce if males are not adequate. Asexual reproduction is efficient and rapid. So if you have asexual reproduction, and we're just going to say all individuals are female because they're all just not really gendered much at all. So we're just going to label them as female. One individual can divide into 2, then 2 into 4, then 4 into 8. However, in sexual reproduction, one female, if they have 2 children, we'll just assume male and female. The male won't be able to carry out a pregnancy, but the female can. The female can result in male and female, and then this female, male and female. So there's not as much rapid population growth when you have males and females in sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction does allow that rapidness to occur, which allows a species to grow in numbers and become a powerful force in its environment. But it doesn't allow for genetic diversity. So if something comes along that can kill one of them, it's probably going to kill all of them pretty easily. Okay, so compare and contrast the outcomes of sexual and asexual reproduction. You should be able to tell me how they're similar, how they're different, what are the benefits of each, or the drawbacks of each. Which of the following characterizes parthenogenesis? Is that A, an individual may change its sex during its lifetime? Is that B, specialized groups of cells grow into new individuals? B, did I say that wrong? Is that B, in specialized groups of cells grow into new individuals? Is that C, an organism is first a male and then a female? Is that D, an egg develops without being fertilized? Or is parthenogenesis E, both mates have male and female reproductive organs? Okay, then within sexual reproduction, there are some different versions of how this can carry out. Some species are monoecious. That means that the animal has both male and female reproductive organs. Here's a couple of sea slugs mating right here. And these are monoecious species. So both of these slugs has male and female parts. Both of them are going to be able to lay eggs that have been fertilized by the other organism. So that's what monoecious is. Hermaphrodites could be identical to monoecious, but they may not be. It's a little bit of a broader term. Organisms that are simultaneously hermaphrodites have both male and female organs at the same time, like our sea slugs here. Or sequential hermaphrodites will begin as one gender, then switch to the other. Typically, they begin as a male, then at some point during their life, they switch to a female. Then there are dioecious organisms. Dioecious is what humans typically are characterized as. Dioecious are animals that have separate male and female of the species. Reproductive cycles are pretty important for most animals, even for asexually reproducing animals. It ensures that an organism is going to be able to be fertile, carry out a pregnancy at a time when they're energetically able to, that their baby is going to be born at a time that the baby could survive. Many animals have reproductive cycles that are related to changing seasons. So, they may be fall or winter, they get pregnant, and then they're born in the spring when there's plenty of flowers and plants starting to grow, as opposed to being born in the dead of winter when there's not a lot of food source. Reproductive cycles are going to be controlled by hormones and environmental cues. And through the last part of this chapter, we'll actually come in and talk about some of those hormones and some of those cues and how reproductive cycles work. But reproductive cycles allow animals to save energy when the environment is not suitable for reproduction. Temperature is often an important cue in reproduction. So things like climate change can decrease reproductive success. So even in something like an insect that might suddenly take that cue of temperature to reproduce and starts reproducing when they normally wouldn't, a little bit earlier in the year, when they normally wouldn't. And so their food source isn't available. Or an animal like a reindeer starts reproducing when the daylight hasn't yet told it to migrate, so their babies are born when they don't have access to the proper food sources. So climate change can decrease reproductive success over a wide variety of animals, and that's a very big concern currently in many countries, and many different animals being endangered or facing extinction due to this. Ovulation is a point when the organism releases mature eggs, not fertilized eggs, just eggs that are ready to be fertilized. That usually happens at the midpoint of a female cycle. Here's a typical cycle for humans, typically about 28 days, although that could range anywhere from 2 weeks to like 6 or 8 weeks in any individual. But in this kind of generic 28-day cycle, ovulation would occur at day 14. So this is the time when that individual would be fertile and able to produce a fertilized eggs. So, parthenogenesis, we mentioned that a couple of times already. Parthenogenesis is the most common form of asexual reproduction in animals that at other times reproduce sexually. What characteristic of parthenogenesis might explain this observation? Then fertilization is the union of a sperm and an egg that produces zygote. This can happen externally or internally. In a lot of aquatic species, external fertilization is found. External fertilization occurs when a female releases eggs. Then the male's sperm is deposited outside of the female's body. This happens a lot in fish. This is happening in these frogs. This frog is laying her eggs, and then this frog is going to fertilize them outside. Here in these frogs, this happens when they're in contact with each other, but this can happen when they're not even in contact with each other. The eggs can be laid, and then the male can come and fertilize them without even touching the female. External fertilization requires a moist habitat or an aquatic habitat so that those eggs are kept moist. Usually you'll see something like spawning when a lot of externally fertilizing animals collect together in large groups and release their eggs synchronously. If they're not synchronous, courtship might be involved in it. So courtship probably evolved in these frogs to bring them together so that the female lays their eggs and the male is there to fertilize them without just being left, may or may not be fertilized. Courtship will trigger the release of the egg and the sperm. So they're going through their courtship act right now, which trigger the female to release her eggs and trigger the male to release his sperm. And that increases the chances of successful fertilization so that neither organism is wasting energy on producing sperm or eggs that don't do anything. Internal fertilization is what we see in a lot of land-based animals. This is when sperm is deposited inside the female's reproductive tract, and then the oocyte is fertilized inside the reproductive tract of the female. This is a good selection, or this shows a lot of natural selection in animals that live on land, because if we laid eggs on the land, it would dry out and not be effective. So this is good for animals that live in non-aquatic environments. However, it does require sophisticated reproductive structures, sometimes complex reproductive structures. There has to be some way for a male to have some sort of copulatory organ that will put sperm into the females, and the female has to have some sort of receptacle that can store the sperm and deliver the sperm to the egg. Sometimes pheromones in courtship are used to bring male and female closer together. Okay, how does internal fertilization facilitate life on land? And then a lot of animals are going to put a lot of attention to ensuring the survival of offspring. So internal fertilization will produce fewer zygotes, but more of the zygotes survive because as they're stored internally, developing internally, they're protected while they develop. A lot of animals that do internal fertilization exhibit greater parental care to those animals. So what mechanisms have evolved in animals with external fertilization to ensure that offspring live to adulthood, or for animals with internal fertilization? Okay, that's all for this part of the lecture. We're going to come back and talk about gamete production, gamete delivery. We'll talk about some anatomy of males and females in part 2. So I'll see you back for that. Thanks. Bye.